times Kazakhstan ended up with just 30% of the ethnic Kazakh population. On the one hand, this era brought a new well-educated generation and established a number of cultural institutions. Through the Russian language, the local population was introduced to the world's art and culture. On the other hand, there was a rejection of Kazakh original culture and traditions and repressions of Kazakh intelligentsia. As the population spoke Russian and kept forgetting Kazakh, the nation started to lose its roots and ethnic identity. Kazakhstan was a periphery of the Soviet Union and one-way destination for Soviet intelligentsia and all kinds of artists, which were the Stalin's political prisoners, and they were all sent to concentration camps or exile. Then, in 1950 or 60s, Soviet avant-garde artists had started to appear in Almaty and exhibit their works. We were just so far away from Moscow that nobody really paid attention on what was happening in Kazakhstan, so they really had a chance to show their works. And this was a great time because under their influence, Kazakhstani contemporary art has started its development. In 1991, Kazakhstan became an independent country, and I witnessed the rebirth of Kazakh patriotism, culture and traditions, and the rise of the state model with one body of citizens, Kazakhstanis, one principal ethnic group, Kazakhs, and one state language, which is Kazakh. And Russian is still an official language which was spoken by everybody, actually. And the state's aim was to create a new national identity that could be shared by 130 ethnic groups living in today's Kazakhstan. They saw it as a safeguard against ethnic conflicts and a foundation for social and economic stability. And stability-wise, this has worked. For the past 20-something years, we have been living together without any deep national conflict. But unfortunately, the so-called guided democracy approach led us to a deep stagnation in the artistic field, to conformism, self-censorship, and academic souvenir art, to the deterioration of the cultural infrastructure and to the decline of the artistic new avant-garde heritage born in 1980s in Almaty. So Almaty had been a capital of Kazakhstan during 70 years. It was a city with a wide network of the major cultural institutions. In 1997, it was decided to move the capital to Astana. Nowadays, Astana is a brand new city built from the scratch, with a huge technically equipped palaces of culture, but with no audience to fill the 1,000-seats concert hall, insufficient or absent in-house technical and artistic capacity in many of the new state-of-the-art performance venues. As there are insufficient professional resources to exploit this new infrastructure and lack of the arts object to be displayed at the museums and galleries, in Astana, the Ministry of Culture has been relocating people and collections from Almaty, thereby causing substantial damage to Almaty cultural resources. And according to the new cultural policy introduced for the first time ever in Kazakhstan last year, Astana should become a new cultural capital, a brand city of Kazakhstan with a series of high-level image-building events. But what's going to happen to Almaty then? It's an open question, and it even looks like we are losing our official status of a cultural capital. This might be not a bad thing after all. There is a vast layer of academic and traditional culture in Almaty. It is a significant and very important part of the cultural heritage. Nevertheless, to the rich cultural heritage of our city, we can apply the economical term resource curse, also known as the paradox of plenty. It refers to the paradox that countries and regions rich with natural resources tend to have less growth and worse development outcomes than countries with fewer natural resources. Just the same way, the presence of this layer of classical, traditional culture prevents the development of contemporary arts and culture. In one of her articles in 2008, well-known Kazakhstani curator and artistic art manager Yulia Sorokina said, "To be a contemporary artist or curator here means to be an enthusiastic person with no institutional support, no sustainable salary, and no local recognition. From time to time, we try to organize exhibitions, workshops, and seminars in Central Asian countries, but they have never captured the attention of business or government bodies." They do not want to open up their minds to contemporary art. And this statement has mostly been true until 5 years ago. It was almost impossible to organize an independent film festival or music or theater festival in Kazakhstan. But today, there are a lot of new fabulous artistic startups in Almaty. A new generation of arts managers in their mid-20s are taking over the artistic theme. And they are strong and active. They have a new mindset and new mentality, but they do need support to move forward and make exciting work. And this is what we would really like to do within the British Council as well. So we would like to help them to bring the international UK artists and to introduce the UK element into the existing festivals. And that's why how we can support them. And at the end of my presentation, I'd like to tell you a bit more about the project British Council is developing now together with our partners, and which will start in this year and continue in the next year. And it kind of summarizes all I have said before in this presentation. So the Atomic Architecture and Architectural Studio of Kazakhstani and UK designers and architects, they initiated a project called Arman Almata, which aims to debate the future development of Almaty. And together with our long-standing partner, International Contemporary Arts Festival Artbatfest, we commissioned Atomic Architecture to design and build an open-air pavilion, a new public space in Almaty. So this pavilion will host a series of activities throughout the summer, from exhibitions to film screenings, debates, and art workshops for Almaty residents. And this pavilion will be constructed so that it can be easily demonetable and rebuilt either in the same location or relocated for the future events. And our plan for 2016 is to present this pavilion during London Architecture Festival and showcase the best work of young Kazakhstani artists and designers at the British Council exhibition space. And the name of this exhibition is City Nomad. It addresses the question, are we more nomadic now than we have ever been before? So this is a brief concept of this exhibition. After 300 years of colonization and communist doctrine, the new generation of Kazakhstani has been searching for the answer to this question during the last 25 years of independence. In recent years, many people have left the country, hoping to find themselves abroad and become welcome members of global society. Some have since returned. Like exotic treasures brought from the Silk Road, they bring their experience and newfound skills back from their travel adventures with the intention of applying this knowledge to develop new industries and reviving old dreams of Kazakhstan. The symbiosis of Kazakh culture and global experience is developing striking and unique results in fashion, music, design, film, and art. And tomorrow during the lunch lecture, I will be telling more about this project, and you're all welcome to come. And I guess this is all from me today. Thank you for your attention. You can always contact me via social media.
Okay, hello everyone. My presentation today is really focusing on what the topic is, which is cultural policies, looking at the global versus the local. When I talk about the local, I'm talking purely about Nigeria, where I come from, because I can tell you a lot more about what's going on from the African perspective, using Nigeria as a microcosm. And the global would be anywhere outside of Africa that have a standing or structured cultural policy which they have worked off of, or cultural institution which they have worked off of, but currently those institutions might be on a standstill or are currently going through some form of evolution to stay relevant in today's world. So for simplicity's sake, I'm going to focus on cultural policy as it affects the creative and cultural industries in Nigeria specifically. And therefore, most of my references will be based on what's going on, the discourses going on globally, which is how does culture benefit an economy i.e. economic benefits, social benefits, job creation, social inclusion, and all those other lovely things that are being said. Like I said, I'll be presenting a very local perspective, and my perspective is going to be based off of interviews I've recently carried out in Nigeria. And the reason I'm going to base this off of those interviews is because there is a serious lack of literature about what is going on in Nigeria with regards to cultural policy, with regards to cultural ministries, with regards to cultural parastatals, and with regards to what's just going on in general. There's a lack of literature, there's a lack of information, there's a lack of data, all of which make my job as a cultural practitioner / activist difficult in understanding how we can push the cultural sensitive development agenda, or if there's anything like that. So I'm just going to go straight into what I have here. I don't have a presentation. So without a doubt, the creative economy is discussed as one that is globally happening. Countries around the world are beginning to see the relevance of the creative and cultural industries. And even now, the creative economy as a concept is being included in things that have to do with politics, policy advocacy, and practice. However, in spite of this debate, Africa's share is still very negligible, even if we know that it has been mentioned that the creative and cultural industries can bring about economic development, increasing national income, as well as job creation, which is very much needed in Africa and in a country like Nigeria, which have very high unemployment youth levels. In terms of global share, we're contributing only 1% to the global economy. And this is despite the fact that the country is rich in talent and creativity. We lack the infrastructure and the capacity to commercialize creative talents to reap the vast opportunities that it has. Furthermore, the lack of adequate data and the fact the majority of the creative endeavors are in the informal sector are obscuring this idea of an evidence-based policy which comes from the creative and the cultural industries. Many of these countries in Africa lack a functional cultural policy, yet cultural production is still going on at very local levels, which have also to an extent, although I cannot substantiate this with data, are being exported and in some cases actually copied internationally. What's important to note is that in 2000, so I'm going to the Nigerian perspective now. In 2013, Nigeria went through a rebase, what is called a rebase, an economic rebase, and where our national growth, our GDP went from somewhere around the lines of 300 billion to about 510 billion, making Nigeria the largest country in Africa. This rebase was done on the revenues from Nigeria's newest business sectors. This included the booming film industry, booming music industry, telecommunications, and e-commerce, all of which fall under the creative industry, sort of. And this is what has made our country become the largest country in Africa at the moment. I'm going to take you to the Nigerian home video industry, which is known as Nollywood. It was recently said that Nollywood contributes about $102 billion to Nigeria's economy, which is about 12% of the total GDP, which is this 510 billion. Sorry, that figure is wrong, sorry. Yeah, no, it makes sense, but yeah. So this is 102 billion out of the 510 billion. Yet the industry is riddled with issues of piracy, lack of funding, inadequate infrastructure, which in itself, although we can commend their efforts in reaching the global market, is still quite limited in its capacity to fully achieve what it can. Our lack of a cultural policy, a working cultural policy, is quite a problem for a lot of cultural industries that are, cultural divisions or areas that are, or fields that are in Nigeria. For starters, we cannot even tell you what these fields are because there is no proper mapping of what these fields are. We can talk about the Nigerian movies, but that's simply because they have been able, despite a lack of cultural policy, to create production to do the things that they are doing despite the lack of and support from the federal level. But we can't talk about things like arts and craft, which are going on at the informal level at a very high production level. So these are a couple of problems we experience by not having a cultural policy in Nigeria, is that there is no mapping, which the cultural policy should have mandated. There is no enabling environment or infrastructure or guide to direct most of these cultural fields. I'm just going to give you a very brief history about the cultural policy of Nigeria, because you won't find this document online or what I'm about to say online. A lot of what I have here has been from the conversations I've had with people who have been working in the cultural field for close to 30 years. In 1967, Nigeria had its first civil war after it had just come out of independence in 1960. And this civil war went on for almost 3 years. And after the Civil War, a couple of cultural idealists came together and were saying, how do we create a platform that can unify this country, which has just been robbed of its unity based on this war. Now, taking into context that Nigeria has 250 plus ethnic groups and over 400 languages, just alone in that country. This is something that was very much a problem because we had just been affected majorly by this war, people now being very much separated. And culture was the thing that was identified as a unifying institution, a unifying structure for the country. And to this end, these cultural intellects constantly putting pressure on the then federal military government to make an institution that would guide how we go ahead with development, culture that would have a cultural approach to how we go ahead with development. And this pressure was further assisted by the UNESCO World Decade for Cultural Development in 1988. And through that, the federal ministry finally created the group that would now go about structuring and forming this cultural policy, which a draft document finally came into effect in 1980. However, that transition from military to democratic rule was not a complete process. And we constantly had coups that were happening, a change in government, a change in ministers of the federal ministries of culture. And this again affected the ability of the government to launch this document, to accede this document, and therefore start its implementation. Following 1988's draft documents, which is still very much what we are mostly relying on, a couple of reviews have happened, reviews which have included international bodies, reviews which have included grassroots bodies at this local level, and reviews which have included the state, reviews which have included cultural activists and all those who we believe were necessary to form or to inform this cultural policy document has been done, the most recent one being done in 2010. However, we're still having a situation where this policy document is still in limbo. It still hasn't been infected within the economy. And when speaking to one of the interviewees who worked for the government, he says to me that there is a high level of bureaucracy and red tapeism that is going on that is making it further difficult for these documents to go out. And this could also be because culture has always been subsumed in other ministries and never fully been seen as an important factor of the economy. And so this is where we are with our cultural documents. And with this absence of the documents, the government cannot address pestering issues that the population has in regards to cultural production and sustainability. Without a policy, it's become difficult to make use of a cultural sector and its capacity to inspire the development of new political concepts. Therefore, cultural policy and the current ways in which the procedures and the institutions are being handled is within the hands of various stakeholders and not necessarily the government. We have artists, we have cultural practitioners within the film industry, within the music industries, all of who are making independent decisions about their own independent efforts, regardless of what the government is doing. This in itself is interesting because you can kind of look at what is the center in terms of decision making. And the center in this case is not the government, but more of these tiny clusters which are being created within the rural areas and the urban areas, all of which are having cultural production. Of course, with a lack of cultural policy, there's been an absence of infrastructure, there is a lack of an enabling environment for these cultural productions to happen. And financing is also difficult because if we do not have a central body or a fund or a guide for we within the cultural sector to go to, then we cannot even access finance. We cannot access whatever institutional or constitutional, should I say, rules that would guide our production and would protect those productions, making sure that they are very endogenous in nature. So just going now to this idea of the global versus the local, understanding that we don't have a cultural policy, understanding that we have a very deficient cultural sector in terms of infrastructure, but also putting into consideration that there's a lot of production that is going on locally in both the informal and formal sector that is being exported. So what is this? What are the consequences of this for the global versus the local? At the global level, the approach to arts and culture is very much connected to people's backgrounds and the level of education and income distribution. This is also similar at the local level. However, new cultural activities or the increasing pluralism of cultural activities which are happening regardless of the lack of cultural policy, as well as digital media, is making a case where traditional cultural institutions are losing their roles as the center and instead creating opportunities for new centers, like I've already said. As stated by one of the interviewees, globalization is inconclusive without localization. Our argument is we are doing things at what we call the peripherals, which is Africa or Nigeria, and which we are exporting to the center, which is Europe, America, even in some cases Asia. However, it's not local in nature. It's very much been diluted by what's going on outside. And this is simply because our cultural policy, which should have protected our endeavors or our production, making it very local, is absent. So what do? We have to take what is going on outside and infuse it with what's going on inside. But despite the richness of our local economy, we're still exporting products that are very much global or very much foreign in nature. This is creating a problem for our economy, but what this is also doing is shifting the power, where the power still remains at what is called the center and not at the peripheries. So I'm just going to go down, okay? So despite the lack of a policy, but what I would say is that we have in the past been able to produce very indigenous material. And what we need is a cultural policy that can assist us in localizing or guiding those who are producing to ensure that what we're producing is local in content, and when we're exporting that to the global is quite rich, making sure that even when we're importing things in, we also try and localize that and merge this idea of a local economy. So what is the local, what is the global? For us, the local is what we are producing in here, the global is what we're exporting out there. Where is the power lying? The power currently lies in the colonial constructs that is being, the cultural policy in itself that we have is very much an adaptation of what is outside, which has been contextualized, though, but is still not being in effect. So therefore, we are still trying to assume what is going on outside as what is ours. So therefore, we still say, although there is some power within our production, a lot of what's going on outside is still informing what we're doing locally, which again affects our ability to really fully actualize this document, because we have other people who are guiding our ability to produce. The way forward for me, or the questions that we would have to look at is, how is aid also affecting our ability to bring out this cultural policy document? It's also a huge factor. We do not have a local structure that is giving us the income or the funding or the infrastructure or the environment to produce, but instead are relying on what's coming on from outside. So that is also affecting our ability to be able to have a cultural policy document that is guiding what we're doing within, which is very important. Also, what is going on within at the government level, which is the idea of red tapeism, constant change of power, and the fact that a lot of that, a lot of what is going on at the government level is very much interest-based, i.e., if I'm in power, I'm going to do what is for me to do, not necessarily what is for the good of for the greater good. And this is a problem we're having based on what's going on politically and socially in Nigeria. So in conclusion, what I will say is we are the local, there is the global. We're still producing at a local level quite vibrantly, although we cannot account for how much production is being done. It is so important that the country in itself is now using cultural policies as a form of understanding their income. And we are exporting, but what we're exporting has a very, very global appeal, a very, very global influence, and therefore we need global validation to show that what we are doing locally is of benefit. So these are the different things that are going on locally in Nigeria, and I hope I've been able to shed a bit of light on that as briefly as possible. Thanks.
Hello. My name is Monica Tsiliberdi, as you heard from Michael, and I work for the Greek Ministry of Culture. As you all well know, Greece has entered the 5th year of economic crisis. We're in the periphery of Europe, but we're in the center of the attention. You realize that the effects of this crisis have gone beyond both economic and political spheres to affect the very fabric of society. At the mercy of the European Commission, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank, Greece and its people are holding on by a thread, while the fear of default persists. Against the backdrop of this severe financial and social crisis, dramatic changes are taking place. Democracy and national dignity are under attack. Neo-Nazi ideas by the Golden Dawn Party are growing in a country which was proud of being the cradle of democracy. When your main concern is how to face a huge humanitarian crisis, culture does not seem to be a big priority. The cultural and creative sector is just one of the many sectors suffering from this current, very unpleasant situation. But before talking about the outcomes of this disastrous crisis, it is very important to offer a brief outline of Greece's cultural and creative sector in national and regional level. Trying to describe the cultural model in Greece is difficult. You can't label as either purely centralized or decentralized. It could be described more like a mixed model. The government maintains a privileged role of setting the primary directions and priorities, especially in the field of cultural heritage. Peripheral authorities are, at least in theory, responsible for developing the sectoral and local operational programs. In this case, the local government's cultural organizations are operating under the arm's length principle and are aligned with central government policy priorities through the appointment of boards of trustees and through the allocation of state subsidies. This shift toward decentralization in Greece took place in the early 80s and resulted in the creation of regional theatre organizations and other local arts infrastructure. It was an idea actually of Melina Mercouri, if you remember her. The principal idea was each region to develop its own theatre and audience. In the mid-90s, the National Cultural Network of Cities was founded. In its framework were created regional centers in order each one of those to cultivate a special domain of culture according to local needs and tradition. This included regional municipal centers for performing or visual arts, ethnography, cinema, literature, etc. Within this framework, the Greek Ministry of Culture had created special regional service entities responsible for local archaeological museums and cultural heritage protection. In fact, through this decentralization policy, most of these regional or municipal organizations were supported financially by the Greek Ministry of Culture and operated under long-term program agreements between the municipalities and the ministry. Also, a large number of independent museums for folk art, ethnography, applied arts, or local history were also financially supported by the Ministry of Culture. At this point, a special reference should be made to the importance of the local festivals, organized or supported by the 375 municipalities of Greece. Festivals in Greece play a wide range of roles for urban regeneration, city branding, tourism, cultural provision, job creation, social added value. They are considered as a field for cultural innovation and act as meeting points of local cultural identities. In most of the times, festivals are organized, managed, and mainly financially supported by the local authorities. They're usually taking place during summer, mainly July and August, in order to attract tourists as well. And their most common themes are music, theater, dance, and folklore. The strategic planning of the festivals is quite short-term, or even completely absent, since the majority of them have not made any provisions for the future. Festivals managed by municipalities or municipal enterprises are much less market-oriented, so it is not a surprise that the best core festivals are organized by companies of the private sector. It is rather obvious that local authorities can further exploit festivals as means to achieve their sustainability by increasing their orientation towards market. Now that I have described more or less the decentralized model in Greece, or the lack of it, let's see what the current situation is. Obviously, such a model creates serious tensions on financial distribution of national or regional resources. In fact, that major national and local museums, local museums and activities, or even private collections and organizations relied only on state subsidies, put a considerable burden onto the state. That is difficult to handle in the current economic context. As you can understand, despite the decentralization trends and the change of the management status of some cultural institutions, culture in Greece is treated as a pure public good, as implied by the financial state support given to the municipal authorities. Privatization of cultural infrastructure and organization does not seem to be part of the current policy priorities. The cultural sector cannot afford to be considered anymore as a minor, low-productive branch of the economy, largely living on subsidies, that is absorbing economic resources more than actually generating them. Because of this wrong conceptualization, cultural activities are often the first and easiest targets of public funding cuts during the current economic crisis. State budget is not and will not be able to continue to support financially all the wide variety of cultural institutions, regional cultural authorities, and museums. In fact, the budget of the Greek Ministry of Culture always represented only a small fraction of the state budget, even in better times. Since the 80s, the ministry has never received more than 1% of the total national budget and has the lowest rate of hiring new permanent staff. It is noteworthy that the last few years culture has increasingly depended for funding on the European Union Community Support Framework, but in using European structural funds for culture, we can see a paradox. These funds can be used only to build museums, but you can't use them to cover functioning costs, for exhibitions and other activities, for hiring staff, or for the continuing maintenance of the building and grounds, unless the expenses can be billed as educational activities or for tourism. We also have to point out the lack of awareness of the local, regional, and national authorities to use the structural funds in a more productive and innovative way. As you can see, the economic crisis is not the only problem. The organization and the management of the cultural and creative sector is also a huge problem. With the possibility of bankruptcy ahead, we must ask, what are our priorities? Until the situation becomes more stable, we must find ways to deal with the present limitations. Ladies and gentlemen, in a country where the public service broadcaster was shut down because of the crisis and more people are fired than hired, our top priority is one: survival. Money may be scarce, but ideas are still abundant. While Greece is suffering by the worst financial crisis in its modern history, an alternative cultural scene seems to be fighting back. National and regional cultural professionals are trying to readjust in the new era of crisis. A new strategy for culture is being developed for this new era. The main characteristics of this strategy, both in the center and the peripheries, should be the minimum cost of every action, the lower dependence on public and municipal budgets and human resources, the investment in new technologies, the effectiveness, and most of all, the sustainability of its cultural action. It is obvious that local cultural authorities cannot function anymore in full power by being heavily subsidized by the state. They have to try to maximize the profits out of the use of the EU structural funds, to try to find alternative funds from other sources, to retrain their staff on cultural management issues, to attract private funding and exploit the institution of sponsoring. We are optimistic that we are on the right track. If artistic expression is seen as having a rich production potential and bear fruit, then the economic crisis cannot harm the restless artistic society. And we're rather optimistic that in difficult times, culture survives. Thank you.
To compare, because they thought to be quite disparate and talking about rather different situations. If you have listened to each other, is there anything you think you have in common? Is there anything you want to learn more about each other?
Okay, I was surprised to hear from Nigeria, from my colleague, that more or less, in a different way, but it is very common, we have the same problems. It's the management and the conceptualization of decentralization in each and every country. We all have the same problems, which are management and how to deal with that. I was surprised by that, actually. I'm sure it's the same in other European countries as well. They do not have a decentralized model, but they pretend to have one. The decisions are still central, and the money comes from the center. That's what I was.
In my opinion, the problem that we have from the very beginning is the lack of an institution. So even the money, you were talking about subsidization of the arts and the culture. It's not something that is even happening in Nigeria and has hardly happened. One thing that you said that I could definitely relate to is the fact that culture is always seen as where you can cut the budget. However, we don't really have a budget for culture per se. What we have are more of intervention funds. So they will put some money, say 3 billion, towards the most noisemaker. So in this case, it's usually the movie industry, which in itself is a problem because then you have local efforts, informal efforts that are happening who cannot access that money because they are pressure groups that are not as active as the movie guys. But why this is the way it is because culture has always, like I said, been subsumed under other industries. And a lot of the things that are supposed to be within the purview of the cultural ministry is usually found in information, is sometimes found in the finance sector, information ministry, the finance ministry, and in some cases the education ministry. So we don't even understand, within the cultural sector, within the cultural ministry itself, we have close to 15 parastatals. National theater, national orientation, Black African heritage, so many of them, I can list them all out for you. All of them supposed to act as a guide or as a sort of institution where people who are, say, painters can go to this particular parastatal to go and find some kind of support. However, this these parastatals also act in a decentralized manner but then a lot of the decisions that are made are not within the cultural ministry, but from the president. And this president is favoring whoever is in control at the moment, like I said, and not necessarily thinking about how can we look at cultural production or these cultural industries which are playing a huge role in our economy and enable them and encourage them, but instead just looking at vested interest. So we, unfortunately, do not even have any support. So I was saying you have festivals, you have the theaters being built and all of that. We want to sell off our national theater, which is a huge part of our heritage. We want to sell it off. And I recently heard someone wants to build a mall there. And this is just the kind of government we're dealing with. They do not understand the importance of the cultural heritage. They do not understand the importance of a cultural building like the National Theatre, which is a problem.
I understood that as a kind of plea for there should be something like a national cultural policy approach. There should be something like
No, there must be, because without the cultural approach, we don't know where to go for it. She's saying financing, she's saying support. There is no support because at the federal level, the money, the income or the revenue that should be given to the cultural sector is in different ministries. So there is no central support for cultural activities. So yes, there must be some kind of cultural institution that is guiding where if we're doing tax revenues, tax rebates for the cultural sector, it's going to that ministry. But in that ministry itself is very much not functioning properly. So that is a problem.
Gala, is there a similar wish in your country too?
I should say that there is a huge state infrastructure of cultural organizations which is in a deep stagnation. And actually, they're dying slowly. But this new generation of arts managers I've been talking about, they were born like 20 years ago, when we became just independent. Most of them studied in the foreign countries, and then now they're back, and they're not really paying attention of state cultural organizations. They're developing their own initiatives, and I don't know, but they managed to find money, some business support. They are working with the sponsors, with international organizations, for example, the British Council or several Goethe Institutes, Alliance Française. And this is how they're having some money for their initiatives. And as for the state, our cultural policy, which has been written last year, it is said that Kazakhstan should be visible on the cultural map, and how it should be visible, because in Astana we should organize a big festivals like Cannes, for example, or we need to develop our movie industries. So it's really commercialized, well, it's a wrong understanding of the cultural industries. So we'll see what's going to happen, but what's happening in Almaty now is just a starting of, as I feel it, it is the start of a new generation of arts managers that slowly organizing their small initiatives will be moving forward the new Kazakhstani contemporary culture. I believe so, at least.
When I try to bring that in our tension from center to periphery, I see a particular situation in your country when you said Astana becoming the new cultural center, what will be with Almaty, but there is a strong political will, let's have this center. And they have the power to organize that, to take what has been already in Almaty and others. So I want to learn more about what's with the periphery in this respect. I learned also from Greece that, of course, there is a traditional pole position of Athens. You talked about the decentralization activities, but how would you find yourself in this relation? Whereas you from Nigeria said there is nothing like a core cultural policy at all. It's different local initiatives. They try to survive. So how would you talk about this tension center periphery? May I ask you, Monica, again?
Well, Greece is particular because it's a touristy destination. So we have the festivals. Festivals are working for action, for culture, and they are also working for tourists as well. So we have lots of cultural activities during summer, especially. Athens,
all over the country.
All over the country, especially in the touristy destinations, but everywhere. Athens, of course, and Thessaloniki, secondly, and Salonika. Athens, of course, is the center. But we have a peculiarities in comparison with other countries. We have a rather rich cultural heritage. So most of the money that it's for culture is going for the protection of cultural heritage. Cultural heritage is very expensive, very demanding, very inflexible. So when we have, let's say, 100 euros for culture, 99 is going to go for cultural heritage. The rest of the activities for contemporary culture is something that it's been done differently. You are subsidized for that, but the vast majority of money is going for cultural heritage. You can understand that. I mean, in Austria, you have also, but when you have to maintain a building of 2,000 or 3,000 years old, which is falling down, and we have 19,000 declared archaeological sites in Greece. We have 250 around, maybe more, archaeological museums, local archaeological museums, except the big museums. I mean, this costs loads of money. And you can't ignore it. You can't say, no, I'm going to give money to something else. You have to give it to protect the church, for example. You have to give millions or an archaeological site. And to have a cultural activity, it's going to cost you peanuts in comparison with what the cultural heritage costs.
Thank you. Would you have a statement also on that? What does that mean, having such a rich and new center for the big rest of your huge country?
Well, the Kazakhstan is a huge country, but the population only 16 million of people. So we are really quite spread around the country, and frankly, we don't really know what is happening in other cities, because for me, for travel from Almaty to Astana, it's taken me 24 hours by train, and so you can imagine. So the mobility is really, there is no mobility for artists, for example, and there is no mobility for people to travel around the Kazakhstan. And having this new city, Astana, as the capital of the city, okay, somebody from Karaganda or Zhezkazgan or any other city far from Astana, they heard about it, they probably have never been, not in Almaty or Astana. So in the cultural policy, they introduced this idea to divide Kazakhstan into 6 different regions, like creative hubs for tourism, for cultural tourism. Probably that would help to develop local tourism within the country, because we don't really know each other. We don't really know the artists from Karaganda, the second biggest city in Kazakhstan. I think till that, this idea to develop the periphery of Kazakhstan is just it's not going to happen, because we don't know if they have any resources. Probably there is no cultural center in other city at all. So all we can now talk about is just 2 biggest cities, Astana and Almaty, and their contradiction between each other.
Mm-hmm. Malika, I remember the statement of Christian in the morning when he said cultural policies should insist in its peripheral status, and by that being a kind of opposition against the mainstream, against the commercialization. Am I right when I heard out of your words that the only chance to develop something in your country is becoming part of a commercialized mainstream, taking models from abroad and give it your own characteristic. But what do you think is this relationship of having no cultural policy on one hand and having models of commercialized cultural activities from around your country? What does that mean?
What I meant was that let me be very clear about this. Okay, so we are not wanting to take other people's culture or dilute our culture. It's just that we don't have and have never had a guiding institution. So we have had to take something else. And like I said, our cultural policy, the drafted one, which has been since 1988, is very similar. It's a universal policy, which is what they call it, which means it's a policy that has been taken, adapted from somewhere else, but contextualized locally. So all of the peripheral versus the center is not really something that I'll say is not as strong in terms of dichotomy in my country, because the local is, the country is so rich in ethnicity, so diverse, language, diversity. So every time you want to say anything that has to do with the central, you have to take into consideration every single state, which is where the ethnic divisions are. And so you cannot have a policy that isn't looking at the grassroots, because the state will call you out and say, well, you haven't taken into consideration our people. So that is why there is a protection, but also it's a problem, because even when you want to put the policy across, they tell you go to the state first and speak to the state. You have to get and they then try to look at their own agenda, their own advantage, and then the policy again is further depressed and cannot come out. So what is going on now, and these different clusters that are currently being the centers, is not necessarily one city. Although we do have the cities like Lagos where people are drawn to because of commercial activity and the fact that there's a promise of income generation or increasing your living standard in Lagos, which is a city, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's cultural activity that is being pulled there. A lot of cultural activity is happening very regional. It's very regional because of the diversity of our ethnicity. And then what we're taking from outside is a condition of a lack of policy.
May I slowly also involve you, but before I would have a similar question to you, Monica. When I was last time in Athens, of course I experienced many of that, what you were talking about. What you did not mention is there are a number of quite prominent private foundations around, building huge campuses, building a huge infrastructure, and I have the impression they are quite wealthy. They are quite able to influence the cultural situation, at least in Athens. Am I wrong?
Well, you're right. I mean, we have some foundations like we have in Greece. We have a big tradition in ship owners. So we have the Onassis Foundation and the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and some similar foundations. Actually, they're not based in Greece. They're international. They're mostly based in Switzerland or somewhere more exotic. And they're giving huge amount of money in Greece for infrastructure and for cultural activities. But the problem is that it's good to have sponsorship, but you can't have culture. Culture shouldn't be made out of sponsors. So now we rely on these foundations because they're the only that they have money and they can spare money for culture. But this is not the right thing to do. You should get money from sponsors, but not rely almost totally to sponsors as we do now. That's my main objection on that, let's say. So for the time being, culture is mostly fueled by these foundations and the structural funds I talked to you before.
Mm-hmm. Are there any questions around from your side? So go on thinking about that. There's one, yeah.
Regarding Nigeria, maybe there's no cultural policy in place in your country, but as far as I know, you have two success stories. Firstly, this is Nollywood, and I believe this is still part of a cultural industry, and I believe this was bottom-up and not top-down by government. And secondly, as far as I know, I heard a success story between Austria and Nigeria. The Nigerian people coming here, taking these specific textiles and raw materials, and there's a kind of added value industry in Vorarlberg, and they're collaborating. So for me, I believe already some good success stories are working, but maybe not part of the official cultural policy. So my question is, do you consider Nollywood as part of a cultural policy, yes or no?
It is like, if you go to Nigeria and you ask about the cultural policy, they'll say it's Nollywood. And that's the problem in itself, because the cultural policy, the cultural industry, I meant to say, they'll say it's Nollywood, or they'll say music, or sometimes they talk about fashion. These are things that are easily exportable. And that's why, for me, a cultural policy will ensure that every single aspect of the creative industry is mapped. So yes, like I said, there are success stories which are being headed by individual stakeholders, individual cultural practitioners, and those are what we know as the creative industry now, as opposed to efforts by the federal government to encourage that sector, or to encourage the divisions of fields within that sector, which we do not know what are within the sector because it's never been mapped. So currently what we have is Nollywood, film, textile, and music, but even there's no protection. Nollywood there's a lot of piracy going on. A lot of our textile is being adapted in other places and mimicked and copied in other places. So again, a cultural policy should be able to protect and guide those different endeavors.
Well, if you allow me, I'd like to kind of build on because, Malaika, you say that there's a need to really map what is going on in Nigeria right now. And I do agree that there's a need to understand, okay, what is going on, what exists, and what does that mean for the actions that governments can take. But I'm wondering to what extent that the question is not more substantial than that. Because if you start out by mapping things, you already know what you're wanting to map. And the question that or something that really kind of emanated from my own research in the region, is that the idea, or the kind of central, globally traveling idea of the creative economy isn't necessarily something that nicely maps onto what exists. So if you use existing frameworks to start mapping what exists, you might end up with something that doesn't really work. And the question there is, are you aware of any initiatives that try to conceptualize what exists rather than trying to map things first and kind of really create an overview, but first see, okay, indeed there is Nollywood, there is the music of P Square and the likes, you have the textiles going on, you have well, some statue making and all kinds of other things that also exist, but how, in what kind of way could that be conceptualized before you start mapping things?
When I say mapping, it's just a term I use because that's what people are familiar with. One of the things that came out of the 1988 policy were these things called parastatals. And these parastatals focus on some contemporary art, some national dance troupes, some so they're all listed out as different parastatals, which are supposed to kind of cater to different areas of the creative industry. Now, if you want to go about indexing or trying to figure out what is going on within the country, this is where you start from. And that's why these parastatals were created. So when you go to them, they already know what kind of production is happening. So that's how you can contextualize it, because it's not going to be, the parastatals are not based off of what already exists, but we're based off of what we as Nigeria have culturally. And that's why you wouldn't necessarily see one that is for digital art, or one that is for technology, or one that is for, so it's very much a local initiative to create these parastatals. And that's how, when we want to map the sector, we then go directly to these parastatals who can then help us with making this process a lot more fluid. I hope that answers your question.
Well, to some extent, it's just that. I'm sorry, but I mean, I think it's a good entry point because of, as you mentioned, it has a great diversity. There are many of these parastatals, but if you only look at them, or mainly at them, aren't you risking to overlook a lot of things that are happening beyond the purview of the government? Because much culture is actually just taking place in a context that isn't necessarily influenced by the government. Either way, it's because it's commercially successful, or because it's so small scale that the government just really doesn't care about it. And how would you bring that into the conceptualization of these Nigerian cultural creative industries?
I think the problem is that we cannot really account for what's going on. And in order for us to fully understand that, the effort needs to start from somewhere. And how do you call or galvanize all these guys together to then say what kind of activities are going on? There has to be a starting point. And that can be the starting point. Already, that starting point is that it is contextual in its nature. But then if we can then say, how do we extend this to go beyond what we currently have as parastatals and ensure that we are including all other components or all other fields of the cultural industry at that point? But for me, anything is a start right now because we do not have anything. So me being able to define what can or what we can do, I mean, putting that into a thought process is actually good, it's great, because it's an opportunity for us to really understand what is going on locally. And then in that way, being able to negotiate that power we keep talking about because we fully understand what the local is. So we can then negotiate the power with the global when exporting and importing cultural products.
Could it be, following your conversation, that there is a request behind that there should be something like a central authority having the overview what is going on, doing this kind of mapping as a basis, producing data for policy making?
We have a central, it's just that the central is very much intrinsically vested. A lot of people that are in power, I spoke to a government official. He was telling me that they've been working towards releasing or launching the cultural policy, but he then had 6-7 deputies. So the ministry had to create positions for them so that they have the opportunity to grow. Now that's the kind of government I'm dealing with. So you cannot get those guys together. They go on trips to Europe, to America, to attend cultural events, all of which do not concern them. These are the kind of things that we're dealing with. We have no interest in the actual development of the creative sector. So we cannot rely on the central, because the central is always changing. The minister is new today, the presidency, he then says to the president, I want this. And that's what he gets.
So to specify, you would like to have a stable center, a reliable one, and I think this goes quite together with Monica when you said there should be a reliable authority, and it shouldn't be given to private actors, for example, when you talked about this quite uneasy situation with private foundations and things like that. And that might be a little bit indifference to the central approach of a guided democracy in your country, just deciding let's have this kind of infrastructure or not. What do you think about it?
Well, what I said before about the foundation, I didn't say exactly that it's unpleasant. I said that we shouldn't rely only on them. We should have money, states, all the municipalities or the peripheries should have money to deal with that. Onassis Foundation shouldn't be responsible for the cultural policy in Greece. It's
That there should be still a strong role of the state.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
But that's a very normative statement, that it should not be only the private sector. So that's a very normative statement. That's not really a fact. It's possible that it could only be the private sector. In theory, you could conceive of such a cultural policy where you actually have a few rich people who decide what they're going to fund. Technically, that's possible, but it's a very normative statement that we shouldn't do it that way.
We shouldn't do it that way because a foundation is taking the decisions whom they're going to fund and whom they're not. I mean, this is not a decision taken. They should support whomever they want, but you shouldn't. A country should not rely only on the private sector, especially when you have 2 or 3 very rich public foundations. I mean, culture. It's not fair, I think.
Yes.
We should.
No, but don't get me wrong. I agree that cultural policy should be something very democratic. Don't get me wrong. The thing is that idea is very, very recent. Up until, well, the middle of the 20th century for most countries, either way, you had rich people or the church who subsidized culture, and they only did that to increase the image of themselves and to kind of make people look up to them, either way as a religious institution or as a rich family. And it's only very recently that we became to see of cultural policy as something that the state should intervene in. And I agree that it's something quite good that we as, not the state as something beyond us, but we as the people decide what we find important in terms of cultural policy. But that is something incredibly recent. And I think it's good to bear in mind that the center of support for culture has always been away from democratic systems for a very long time. Whether it's in Nigeria with chieftaincies, whether it's the church, the Catholic Church in much of Europe, whether it's any big merchant family, it's always been private people deciding what culture should be and whom it should enlighten.
Thank God we had the Industrial Revolution and 2 wars, and the culture became far more democratic. Because otherwise, I mean, the Medici era was great, but it's not the Renaissance anymore. It's the 21st century.
Okay. We have 2 hands.
I will directly talk about Nigeria, but my question will go to any of you. Please, thank you for all you've said so far. I quite agree with most of the things you shared. I am from Nigeria too. I unfortunately have not been following political news, but as an art student, I have a shared interest in listening to what is coming out of there on the art feed. So I read some time ago that the federal government gave $500 million to Nollywood.
300.
Yeah, so you mentioned that when someone is asked what is culture or whatever, they simply say Nollywood, which is completely not supposed to be so. So what about the other sectors, and what are the artists doing about this? And if I must react to this, it is up to we, the people, to really say this is right and this is wrong. Thank God that so many things have taken shape in the past years. The music industry, the movie industry, the textile industry is booming as well, and it is not because we relied on the government. But there is something really, really bad that I think we cannot talk about right now. Like in Nigeria, I heard that the museums are sponsored by private companies, private, interest. And they decide what should be exhibited. So this also doesn't make the work of an artist really easy because they don't eventually speak out of what they create. They want to satisfy the sponsors. So is it really true in Nigeria and in your countries? Does this practice also come like regularly, or is it an international standard? Yeah.
I run an agency called a White Space Creative Agency, and we have a space which we hire out, and sometimes we moonlight as a gallery. Now, what I will tell you is that these independent galleries are more often the ones that artists come to when they want to present their work or do whatever it is they want to do with their works. If you go to a national museum in Nigeria, you will be appalled by what's going on there, except for the ones that are privately sponsored by banks and whatever and all of that. A lot of them usually just have the logo of the bank or something like that to show that this is what it is. But these banks are more promoting what they're about. Our social corporate responsibility is this, adding value to culture, not necessarily dictating what is going on within the museums, because it is the value and the nature, the process of Nigeria is the fact that people are very much about themselves. So a private organization will give money to somebody and tell them, as long as you put my logo when we're going in, I'm good with whatever you're doing in there. I'll give you this amount of money. And that's very much why the private sector, a lot of these artistic and creative endeavors are being sponsored by the private organizations, because they're the ones that will give the money and that's a way of pushing out their own agenda and also ticking that box of corporate social responsibility. Like I said, it's hard for us we have to rely on independent players because the government have not mobilized themselves well enough to be able to answer our questions, answer our demands. So we are having to do a lot of those things ourselves. And that is true, it is a problem. The fund that was given to Nollywood, again, is a characteristic of what we have seen. They put pressure, we're doing so well, it's bottoms up, we're doing so well, you have to now come and support us. So the government is like, okay, give them, let them get off my back. But the thing is, we have the artists who are in the local sector, who are sculpting, who are doing the textile, and they don't have the union or the associations that can push their agenda. So it's who makes the loudest noise, who can get directly to the presidency, who can get directly to the minister that will get the benefits of whatever the center has for the masses, the citizens. So therefore, it is very much up to the independent, unfortunately, to decide what is going on within the cultural sphere. It's very much up to the private organizations and the artists themselves to make those decisions for their own interest. Because if they go, they don't even know where to go. There's no link or website I can go to that will tell me, as a visual artist, this is the institution I have to go to within the government sector to ask questions, to know more about how I can enable myself. There's nothing like that. And the man I spoke to from the government sector said, it's unfortunate, but these are the realities. This is what he says to me. He's so jaded. He's like, well, I don't know if we'll see a cultural policy soon, but we are working hard. And that's the kind of stuff that you hear. So.
Yeah, very briefly. I would like to bring it back to the question of cultural policies as part of democratic policies. I mean, that's basically the question here. The question is only how or what does it entail? Obviously, it's a very, very complex matter. So what are the mechanisms that are needed? Which groups in society need to be considered? What does participation mean in this process of actually drawing up a cultural policy which is based on democratic policies? What does it mean in a specific historical situation as well, and how is it being negotiated in the public sphere? So when I thought of Chantal Mouffe when I heard about the situation in Kazakhstan, which you described as stagnating through consensus in a kind of, so an agonistic and not antagonistic public sphere, where things need to be negotiated, and that doesn't mean to be populist, but really to negotiate the ideas of participation, and also, yeah, who is part of that process of drawing up a cultural policy? And I'm sorry if this is not really a question, but more a kind of a global consideration, which I find ever more necessary to really think about.
Thank you for this hint. Any immediate reactions?
I was a part of the working group writing the cultural policy for Kazakhstan last year. And the process was really interesting, actually, because from the very beginning it looks really optimistic. There were several independent researchers, artists who was gathered together and writing this document, debating all these things. And we created a very nice document. And after that, it was given to the Ministry of Culture. And these documents spent with the ministry like for some time. And then they gave us back our document, which looked really, really different. And it was really like several sentences which were left from the previous document. And I was really grateful that at least those sentences were left, because we can now do something based on these sentences at least. And our idea was like, there was idea of the Minister of Culture that the Kazakhstan will be divided into 6 creative hubs. And we tried to, at least for our city, for Almaty, we have written that Almaty should be a creative hub for all the Kazakhstan, because historically it was a part of, it's a cultural capital. It's rich of the resources, and probably if we will say that Almaty is a free creative zone, like free economical zone, so people could come to our city, develop their initiatives, and this will be first step to probably adapt this model to the other cities. But it also, everything is really dependent on the personality of the people in the ministry and the local government, because before that, while we were reading that, let's say, the cultural policy of the city, the head of Department of Culture of Mayor's office was a really active and interested in the cultural development person. Now he is gone. A month ago, he was moved to any other department, and we don't really know what's going to happen with all these ideas. But thanks to the people who was writing this document together, probably we will try to persuade the new person who will be put as the head of the Department of Culture to move forward with this idea, but I don't know.
We shouldn't we have the state fundings, we have the cultural policy designed by the state, we have the sponsor, whatever. But we should underestimate the artists themselves. Sometimes, even if you have on paper the best policy design, it's something different, or you have money allocated to that reason. It's the artist communities that they make. I mean, in Greece, I said that we have a crisis and we have difficulties, but art is flourishing. That's a surprise, actually, but it's a need for artistic expression. People need to express themselves, and they use art to do it. You need money to make art, but you can have art without money. We shouldn't underestimate that, or we shouldn't overestimate cultural policies without saying that we don't need one. That's what I want to say.
I would like to close this round with a maybe provocative question, mainly to you, Gala, when you talked about this massive influence of the Soviet cultural policy producing this infrastructure. This is gone. But instead of that, there are other actors around, and I mentioned the Soros Foundation, but it's also the British Council, some foreign powers trying to intervene. What does that mean, having something from elsewhere, trying to cooperate, to influence, and a little bit, this might be also true in your case, you have a background from Warwick, from Leicester, there are different ways of cooperating, intervening, influencing. What does that mean?
It is a provocative question, Michael, yes, you're right. Well, actually, these persons who work in international organizations, they're all locals. And me, being a local person within the British Council, I understand I understand very good the situation within, and I can take what I think is right from the global culture, from the global society, bring into Kazakhstan and to build on and to add some value. So I think this is our reality, and we need to be very true with ourselves that we're always very influenced by other cultures. Well, it was the Soviet culture, now it's a global international culture, and this is our reality. This is probably our new identity. So we are living in a very open world now with all these internet connections. Probably this is our identity, and we need to just agree and move forward.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I have a problem with that. Simply because where I come from already, we barely have a cultural heritage that is rich enough, despite the fact that we have such rich ethnicities that have different products, cultural products. And what happens with international organizations, excuse me, because I work closely with the British Council, is that when you want to do something with the British Council, there's an agenda which is almost colonial in nature, because you have to work with the UK to be able to do something with Britain, which doesn't necessarily help the cause of furthering this idea of enriching our cultural heritage, but more of best practices, which is further diluting a production that is already very much global in nature, which is what I am trying to say a cultural policy should be able to protect. So although you should say this is our reality, the reality is also that when relating, the British Council sometimes acts as an independent body, doesn't take into consideration what is going on at the federal level, which is the government, the central level, but then comes to artists, individual artists, and helping them with their efforts, but then further diluting it to kind of meet a global or local characteristic. So that for me is a problem in itself. And I wouldn't necessarily agree that it's very much in our interest, even if it does have its benefits. Yeah.
Well, we all follow, the rest of the earth is following more or less the Anglo-Saxon model of cultural policy, even if we don't want to admit it. But we're based, I mean, the idea that culture has economic importance and things like that, it's an Anglo-Saxon idea. But internationalization is not bad. I mean, in Europe, it's a kind of international, we all want that, I think. We should want that. I don't know, I don't have anything else to add.
Thank you very much for your interventions. It's just the first part. We will have a continuation, if you want, tomorrow during lunchtime, at least with Gala and Maleka. Monica has to go back to Greece. Thank you very much for your contributions.